talks about his Samuel Johnson Prize-winning book, Mao's Great Famine, with Jonathan Shainin, senior editor at the Caravan. Please welcome them.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this mirthful topic. I'm very honored to be up here with Frank Dikotter, who, as we've just heard, won the 2011 Samuel Johnson Prize for his grand book, Mao's Great Famine. Frank is the author of many works on modern China, including The Discourse of Race in Modern China, Patient Zero, China and the Myth of the Opium Plague, and The Age of Openness, China Before Mao. As I said, it's an honor to be up here with him. We're going to be talking about Mao's Great Famine today. And I wanted to start out by asking Frank about the archival research that went into this book, how he found the archives that he used to put together this narrative, and what the major discoveries in those archives were.
Great. Well, let me get started right away. How did I get into these archives? Well, by knocking on the door with a letter of introduction. Well, of course, I've spent the best part of my career working in archives, and until about the end of the 1990s, the great exciting period to work on was the Republican era, or the half century before the communist takeover in 1949. That's when the archives opened up. And that was the last frontier, if you wish. But I've always kept an eye on post-49. I've always had a great interest in one-party states. But I always thought that you can't really research them without good source material. So when I arrived in London, when I arrived in Hong Kong from London in 2006, it was a good opportunity for me to cross the border much more frequently. So this was my weekly schedule in 2006. I would get up on Monday morning round about 6:30, get a taxi to the railway station, pop by Starbucks for my coffee. I get onto the train to Canton, Guangzhou, and round about 9:30, 9:40, I would be in the provincial archives reading material on the post-1949 period. And I discovered very, very quickly that there was a mountain of available material that very few historians had looked at. So I decided to really focus on the period from 1958 to 1962 when the Great Leap Forward took place. My initial query was simply to find out more about the lives of people. The question was very simple. Where are the people in the People's Republic of China? Where is their history? So much has been said about all the pronouncements of Chairman Mao and whatever policy changes took place, but that doesn't tell us anything about the lives of people of all walks of life on the ground. And when I discovered so much material, I decided to focus on the famine.
So before we come to what you discovered in the archives, you've talked a bit, I think, about the idea that, well, the central archives are, bolted and locked shut, and I assume very difficult to access for a, Chinese writer or a foreign writer, that the provincial archives had a lot more material or provided an opportunity to get a sense of what was happening on the ground during these terrible years.
Yes, absolutely. The central archives are pretty much closed with the exception of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Now, China's a big country. It has a lot of provinces in there. So when you come around and you have that proverbial knock on the door and they look at you and they tell you to bugger off, well, then you still have a very long list of other provinces where you can go and try your luck, which I did. And as I said, sometimes I was rather lucky. Sometimes I was told rather politely to go somewhere else. And occasionally there was just this mountain of material on which I spent literally weeks and weeks. Let me give you a sense of a flavor of the kind of material you get. The term archive is rather stern and daunting. I'm talking, for instance, about verbatim interviews, verbatim transcripts of interviews that took place in 1961. Here's a social welfare worker who has found several abandoned children in the city of Nanjing. So she asked this little boy, age 5, to say what happened. What happened to you? What are you doing here? Oh, well, my mummy took my little sister and me up into the mountains. And then we lost my little sister. Ju, in Chinese, Ju means basically abandoned. And then on the second day, I woke up and my mummy was gone, quote unquote. Extraordinarily gripping material. The letters written by ordinary people, all the way up the chain of command. One letter I found started by saying, "Dear Chairman Mao, 亲爱的毛主席，你肯定很忙吧? Dear Chairman Mao, you must be very busy." And then the person starts describing the horror that has happened in his village. Let me give you another example. A very neatly detailed table of more than 50 cases of cannibalism compiled by the Public Security Bureau, cases that took place in one single village in Gansu province, with the name of the victim, the person who got eaten, the name of the culprits, frequently a family, the manner in which the corpse was found. Was this a foreigner who was beaten on the head, or was it somebody who was dug up? Was it a corpse dug up? And for how long this went on. Extraordinarily detail here, with names of people, with investigation reports, a wealth of material.
So before we get further here, let's talk a bit, in case anyone in the audience is not fully familiar with the broad outline of what happened. And I'd like us to start around 1956. And you open your book by talking about the death of Stalin and Mao's relationship with Stalin, and then what I guess was a rather tempestuous relationship that Mao had with Khrushchev, and some sense of the way in which this drive that would come to be the Great Leap Forward, I don't know what the right word is, was inspired or was kind of born out of a desire on the part of Mao to reassert his sort of supremacy among the kind of community of world communist leaders. So give us a bit of a sense of, you know, what's going on between 1956 and 1958, which is, I believe, when the famine really begins.
Right, so where do we start? You could start at anywhere in 1949 with the advent of the Communist Party and the People's Republic. I picked 1953, the death of Stalin, and I'm sure some of you may have heard of this man. He was the head of the Soviet Union and, of course, the leader of the socialist camp, which covered pretty much half of planet Earth at the time. And Stalin's death was Mao's liberation. Mao had lived in his shadow for many years, supported financially by the money of the Soviet Union and, of course, also the advice of good old Joseph. But Mao thought that he was a much more determined revolutionary. He, after all, and not Stalin, had brought a quarter of humanity in the communist camp. And he, after all, not Joseph Stalin, had fought the Americans to a standstill during the Korean War. So when Joseph Stalin left this world, Mao thought that this was his moment. Now, of course, he did not become leader of the communist camp. Khrushchev did, as you pointed out, a man best remembered for banging his shoe on a podium during a session at the United Nations in New York, a very erratic, impulsive man who Mao held in utter contempt. But his chance came a few years later when Khrushchev invited all the leaders of the communist world to come to Moscow to celebrate the 40th birthday of the Bolshevik Revolution, which took place in 1917. So now we are in 1957. And there in front of all the assembled leaders, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in the production of dairy products within 15 years. Now, Mao saw this as a challenge, and he didn't waste a moment to say that if the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in the production of dairy products, China would overtake the United Kingdom, still seen as a major industrial power at the time, in the production of steel within 15 years. This is very much the start of the Great Leap Forward. Now the question is, how did Mao think he could do it? And I think here's the crucial point. Mao saw the wealth of the country in the hundreds of millions of villages across the country. And he thought that if you could just unite all these people, transform them into foot soldiers in a giant army that you could just deploy in one task after another, in one continuous revolution, have farmers work on water conservancy projects during the slack winter months, have them work in the fields during spring and produce iron in backyard furnaces during the summer, then surely China could catapult itself past its competitors. Well, we all know what happened.
Well, to what
that
extent
attempt.
at the beginning of this was this a move on the part of, I get a sense from reading the book that, first of all, when Khrushchev stands up and denounces Stalin, and I'm thinking that is in 56, but I may be wrong about that. Does that come later? That Mao sees this, ironically, as a threat to his own authority. And I wonder to what extent, both in your research or in terms of what's in secondary sources, was part of the impetus for the Great Leap Forward, sort of driven by internal politics. To what extent does it represent Mao's efforts to ensure that no one among his sort of, ring of lieutenants can supersede him?
Well, that is part of the story, but ultimately you have to imagine that Mao is somebody who sees himself as having brought a quarter of humanity into the communist camp in 1949 against all odds after 20 years of guerrilla warfare. And against all odds, he managed to beat the United States, or at least fight them to a standstill during the Korean War. So round about this time, 54, 55, 56, you have a chairman who's pretty much convinced that he knows how to go about the business of communism. There's a man who sees himself as some great historical figure, and if only he could find that golden bridge to leap from socialism into communism, then he will be the one who will lead planet Earth into a different era. And that golden bridge, he finds it.
And this is the mass collectivization of the countryside.
It's the radical collectivization of the countryside. It's the people's communes. It happens in the summer of 1958 when he tries to herd, well, he doesn't try, he herds thousands of families together in giant collectives where people live according to what happens in the army. This is the great continuous revolution. This is the militarization of the countryside where you separate out man and women.
And some of these are huge, right? 20,000 people, 30,000 people.
Huge, massive collectors where you eat in collective canteens, where food is distributed by the spoonful according to merit, where you send your children to boarding schools, where kindergartens take care of toddlers, where everything is done according to military regimentation, where every little bit of property is taken away from these villages. Just imagine what happens to the farmer when the land is taken back. This already happened in 1956, when the grain which he grows is procured by the state at a price which is below cost of production, when his tools, utensils, chicken, ducks are taken away and collectivized, when even his home is confiscated. That is radical collectivization.
So let's get back now to sort of what were the, you've talked about this radical collectivization. What were the other directives that were coming from Beijing, and how did you find these played out in the archival material that you're seeing? I'm thinking here that, part of the difficulty of writing a book like this is that you're having to sort of, assemble from bits and pieces that you're finding in many different places, and from various strata up the chain of command, whether it's at the very top or in the middle or at the very bottom, and trying to produce from this a kind of syncretic view of what were the orders, how were they passed down, and where did they go wrong? Yeah. Or maybe in what way did their initial wrongness manifest itself when they started to be put into practice?
But of course, you never go into the archives knowing the answers to the questions you have. At least I don't. I want to just find out. In year one of any project I do, I'm completely lost. I read as much as I can, and by reading I get more and more questions. And it is only at the very, very end that I'm able to answer some of them. But I can tell you about 3 important discoveries I made throughout my journey, if you wish, through the archives, which took place over 3-4 years. The first thing that really struck me was that I was expecting famine, but I found violence already on day 1 in these provincial archives of Guangdong in Guangzhou. You know, where you get that little train from Hong Kong, the one I mentioned earlier on?
Yep.
On day 2, I found a report about a child who had been tied up and thrown into a pond and left to drown for the simple reason that he had stolen a handful of grain. Now, at first I thought, my God, this extraordinary violence must be very specific to the southern region. But as I went from archive to archive, I found that the violence was pervasive, chronic. There were people beaten for falling asleep. About half of local cadres, party officials, pummeled and beat the people they were meant to represent. Another child was locked up in a hog's cage, again for somehow not working hard enough. People were tortured, had their hair ripped out, their ears lopped off. There's one document that talks about, and here I quote, people had their noses dug out and their mouths torn off. I don't even know how you do that. More common was to cover farmers in urine or force them to eat excrement. The case of Wang Ziyo was reported to the top leadership. Here is a man who, for stealing a sweet potato, had his legs tied up with iron wire. Then somebody dumped a 10-kilo stone on his back. One of his ears was cut off, and for good measure, he was branded like an animal with a sizzling tool. In Sichuan, some people were doused in petrol and set alight. Some people were buried alive or were forced to bury their own family members alive. Extraordinary violence. The question became why? Where does all this violence come from? And I referred to it earlier on when I said that with radical collectivization, everything is taken away from the villager. There's no incentive left to work, in particular when you're hungry. So when there is no carrot, all the local cadre has left is a stick. This is a period during which people are considered to be nothing but just figures, a resource to be deployed for the greater good, just like grain or coal. The state is everything, the individual nothing. Is worth assessed through work points and determined by the ability to somehow move earth or plant rice. So these are very bleak calculations in which life is nothing. So violence is pervasive. It indicates how coercion and terror are very much the foundation of the regime at the time. But then it went a bit further. I discovered that violence was also linked to something else. Namely that if there isn't enough food to go around, violence becomes a way of somehow eliminating the weaklings, unproductive elements, the slackers who somehow don't work hard enough. Violence becomes a way of somehow coping with a very limited food supply. So the weak, the sick, the elderly get eliminated, cut off from the food supply. Horrendous levels of violence. And this brought me to my second discovery, something I hadn't quite anticipated either, rather naively, I think, namely that food was used as a weapon. It's one thing to beat somebody, or tie him up and drown him, or bury him alive, but the most widespread form of punishment against people who fall asleep, people who don't work hard enough, people who somehow come from the wrong class background, is just to deprive them from food, to cut off access to the collective canteen. So I discovered that there is a really fundamental distinction between people starving to death and people being starved to death. There is food, but food is used as a weapon. It's not distributed to others. There are inspectors who go around in teams in Sichuan province, and they discover that up to 80% of the people who died of hunger had been denied food as a form of punishment. That was my second discovery, the use of food as a weapon. And on the third one, I didn't set out to really play with numbers, so to speak. As I said earlier on, it is the regime who really sees people as mere digits on a balance sheet. So I didn't want to replicate that attitude. I wanted to find real people with real names and real stories. But ultimately, I came across so much material in which sometimes very brave government officials went around calculating how many people had died from 1958 to 62. I thought I have to take this into account.
Yeah.
And by using all this material in the archives and comparing it to the published statistics on which all estimates had been based hitherto, I came up with the number of at least 45 million people who died unnecessarily from 1958 to 62. It's a controversial figure, but it's enormous, and I can't quite get my head
Well, I want to talk
around
more
it.
about this number. What was the sort of previous estimate, and how does one reckon your number against that? You know, what had you done differently, or what were you able to take into account from the archival research that allowed you to establish what you felt was a more precise accounting of the number of dead?
The numbers vary, as you can imagine, enormously depending on what sort of methods demographers adopt, because the reality is that every single estimate has been proposed by demographers on the basis of published statistics. Now, if you've worked on one-party regimes, you will know that published statistics are not entirely reliable, to say the least. So what I managed to do is find so much evidence compiled at the time by public security bureaus, by investigation committees, by very powerful teams sent by Beijing, that I could compare those figures with the published ones. And that's why I reached my number of at least 45 million. So it's not a precise number, it's a sort of threshold.
Right.
But let me just give you, in less than a minute, an example of the kind of material I found. Here's a report that comes from the head of the Public Security Bureau of Sichuan Province. It's a province about twice the size of France. And in beautiful calligraphy, the head of this Public Security Bureau writes to the man in charge of Sichuan Province, a mass murderer who goes by the name of Li Qingquan. And he says, look, here are all the numbers, and they're all add up. It's several pages of it. And you read at the end, it says over 10 million. 8 million of these are unnatural deaths in Sichuan. That's one single province. Let me try to maybe take another minute to tell you what it is that I'm trying to get at here. We've all heard of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. And we talk about Pol Pot, the term genocide comes to mind. But we're still talking, including myself, in the title of the book, about famine. But famine is a misnomer. When you have Pol Pot and a population in Cambodia of 8 million, and 1.6 to 2.2 million people vanish, worked to death, starved to death, beaten to death, that's a very large proportion of the population. But I could take one single region, Fuyang region, in one province, Anhui province. Fuyang region has 8 million people. And out of those 8 million, 2.2 have been worked, beaten, starved to death. It's comparable to what happened under Pol Pot. But that's just one region. You'd have to multiply it by 20. Take Pol Pot, multiply it by 20. You will get somewhere near the horror that happened in China from 1958 to 62.
Well, I want to talk about, I feel like there's a bit of a dilemma here where, I mean, you said at the beginning that, you know, part of the point of your research was to contrary to how the state saw these victims, to see them as more than numbers. And yet I think there is a sense, and I'm assuming you share this, that if we are to truly understand the horror of what happened, we have to have a number, and that, you know, for better or for worse, however uncomfortable, we have to look at this disaster, or this mass murder, if that's the word you want to use, in the you know, you've attracted some controversy for saying right at the start of the book that, you know, this is a situation that is comparable and in fact exceeds the death toll under Hitler, the death toll under Stalin. Do you feel that that's, you know, a comparison that we can't do without? That in order to get people to understand the magnitude of what happened, we simply have to kind of, you know, look at this event in the context of things that are already understood to kind of represent the height of human evil or man's capacity for inhumanity?
I think it's important to get, as I said, we covered the voices of these people. Most of the book is about that. There's only one chapter out of about 40, which is called The Final Tally. But I think it is important to have that one single short chapter so that we get just a sense of the magnitude of what happened. It's about equal to the number of people who died during all of the Second World War. It is important. And I'd say it's even more important for, the book is written in English, for an audience who might occasionally think that a death under Stalin or a death under Hitler is somehow more important than a death somehow far away in China.
Is the book available in China?
It's available in Hong Kong. Don't ask me whether that's part of China or not. I think it is.
But have there been, I mean, do you know, do people there, do they have access to it? Do they read it? Is there discussion in China about what you have found?
Oh, there's a great culture of piracy in the People's Republic. I'm quite sure that you can very easily download my book, and please go ahead and do it. Download it and photocopy it and read it. There is a debate about it, and of course it's quite split. It hurts to read about not just Mao, but also about the People's Republic of China in a negative light. It doesn't look good. So it hurts both, if you wish, not just the believers of that particular ideology, but also nationalists.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, as you're trying to put together, I mean, I think one of the things that, lingers as a question is, I mean, I think you have tried to establish, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that so much of this carnage was not accidental. This was not merely a matter of some sort of misguided state planners or a kind of naive hope on the part of Mao that, we could make steel in backyard ovens and things like that. When you're doing this kind of archival research, what are you looking for, or what counts as or can stand in as evidence to show, for lack of a better word, the motive, the extent to which these things were deliberate? This is not a Mao had a kind of, we're not talking here about a situation where Mao had a misguided idea and, a few bad apples at the provincial level, put it into place in a less than ideal way. How do you try to kind of get a sense of that chain of command and a sense of Mao's ultimate responsibility? And I know that you feel that ultimately he is the person who has to bear the responsibility for this number.
Indeed. Well, as you read through his material, you manage after a while to just put together how the commands are issued and how they're carried out. And occasionally you get very lucky, as I did, and you find a smoking gun. For instance, when I read the minutes, which nobody has read hitherto, it's all, kept under wraps. The minutes of a meeting that took place in Shanghai on the 25th of March 1959. And Mao says that you should just go out there and take 1/3 of all the grain. Now, when you take 5% or 10% of a family's food, this is already very tough. You take 1/3, you reduce them to sheer starvation. He gives this order. He makes available trucks to go, or lorries, to go and carry out the order. And he also says, he who strikes first prevails. And I kept on thinking, well, what does that mean? He who strikes first prevails. One of these mysterious Mao statements. But then later on, I found that one of his lieutenants explained precisely what this meant in a telephone conference to all the provinces. And Tan Zhending is the man, explained that he who strikes first prevails means that you should go there and get the grain before the farmers get to it. And he explains the heads of these provinces that this is warfare, this is war against farmers. You have to go out there and get it. And if you're afraid of carrying out warfare against farmers, then you are a rightist. So you can read.
And we know what happens to rightists, yes.
No, not good.
But what do they intend to do with this grain that they go out and, right? They're going out, they need to seize this grain. What for?
Well, they need it to feed the people in the cities. They need it to pay the bill, because in 1958, the People's Republic went on a shopping spree in the Soviet Union, believing that it could fuel somehow its great leap forward by importing massive amounts of modern technology from the Soviet Union. So these are several causes. But of course, something else happened. A lot of that grain just rots. It just disappears. It's wasted because this is a planned economy.
Right.
You have to imagine that you have somebody sitting in Beijing who tells precisely what should be produced, in which region, where it should be sent to, what the cost is, etc. Everything is planned.
Right. Well, I think there's a sense, I mean, in more recent literature, this is an idea I associate with Amartya Sen, right, that, famines are man-made phenomena. And if you look at the famine in British India, if you look at some of the famines that took place under Stalin, but this is not just man-made. I mean, there's more to it than that, right? I mean, this is not merely the state is moving grain to where it shouldn't be. There's a kind of maliciousness.
There is. Those who often are banned from the canteen are banned for political reasons, not just slacking or falling asleep, but sometimes for having families who are described as rich peasants. So it's all extremely politicized. But one point I wish to make is that it is not just in a planned economy and radical collectivization, human lives that are destroyed. Of course they are. It's the destruction of a whole society. It's a transportation system that creaks to a halt before it collapses altogether already by the end of 1958, unable to cope with all the demands of the planned economy. Here you have over 100,000 tons of grain that have been collected in Hunan province, waiting by the roads of that province in 1960, but there aren't enough lorries and there's not enough fuel to carry it away. So a lot of it just rots while people are foraging for roots to somehow stay alive, sometimes reduced to eating mud. There is an attack on nature. We will never quite know the extent of forest coverage lost, but up to 50% in some parts of China, 50% of the forest is cut down. Houses, you ask me, what do you look for in archives? I'm always looking for something I don't really understand. And one thing I read early onwards is how houses in 1958 were torn down and then somehow reduced to powder, which was used to fertilize the fields. I thought, how can you do that? Well, after a while you start thinking about it, and indeed if there is a mud hut in which animals have been kept, there is some organic matter in there. But before you know, here is a competition, between brigades, between platoons, between companies, between people's communes, who can produce more fertilizer, who can tear down more houses. And then besides producing fertilizer, houses are torn down for other reasons, to punish the farmers who have tried to hide some of the grain under a floorboard or inside a coffin, to get bricks to build these people's communes. There are all sorts of reasons why houses are torn down. So in the case of Hunan province, I came across a letter from Liu Shaoqi, number 2 in this hierarchy, who writes to number 1, Mao, in Beijing. And he says, on the basis of what he has seen in Hunan, he's reached a conclusion that up to 40% of all the houses have been destroyed in that province. Up to 40%. Wow.
And how does this, I mean, do you get any sense from what you read in the archives of kind of how this mass hysteria sustains itself? I mean, I was going to ask you, are there individual acts of resistance? Are there people who try to, whether they're party officials or farmers or, I mean, does no one, is the power of the state so coercive that no one is able to stand up and say, hang on, this is madness, what are we doing? We're tearing down our own houses, we're throwing pots and pans into furnaces, let's get a hold of ourselves here.
Well, the party purges itself all the time, as most one-party states do, go around and purge. And the reality is, of course, that almost every report I used has been signed by one or several individuals, and you could see them as somehow being subversive.
By chronicling what really took place.
By chronicling all this, what was happening. By taking an opportunity or a chance to do it. I came across one report by a man in the Public Security Bureau who was asked to change the figures, he refused to do it. Well, he ended up in a labor camp. But ordinary people too are not just simply waiting for starvation. They slack at work. They allow natural inertia to take over. farmers in the field will work under the watchful eye of a passing car, but once the man is gone, drop their tools, sit by the road and wait. They steal. People have to steal as much as they can just to stay alive in the countryside. They will try to clip spikes of grain that haven't fully matured yet, and ground the grain in their hands and eat the raw green kernels straight out of sight from the militia. Grain on the move
Right.
is exposed to a plethora of thieving hands, guards in charge of granaries steal, cooks in these public canteens, of course, filch and take food away. You have to be very clever and live on your wits in order to get through this enormous mess that is the Great Leap
And
Forward.
everyone, you have to steal to live, you have to lie to live, you have to cheat to live.
Absolutely.
You have to turn against your brother, your cousin, your neighbor.
Well, that's the tragedy, is that in the beginning, of course, if you can steal from the state, that is wonderful. And in some cases, village leaders, instead of exploiting their farmers, actually side with them. And then you have very powerful forms of subterfuge and collective theft that emerge when villagers just distribute the grain straight to farmers. But once that runs out, the extraordinarily sad, horrendous side of the famine is that people start turning against each other. They steal from neighbors. Before you know it, as social cohesion unravels, the family becomes an arena of strife, jealousy, conflict. Man steal from women. In one case, Wang Jiuchang is a man who systematically takes the food ration of his 8-year-old daughter in Liuhe, a small town in Jiangsu province. And then during the winter, he takes her cotton padded jacket and trousers as well. This girl dies of sheer misery. And this is where you see that it's not just a matter of farmers resisting against the state, just people being reduced to making absolutely horrendous choices.
Well, I feel I've seen you somewhere quote Primo Levi, in fact, to this extent, you know, this sort of idea of the drowned and the saved.
That was an extraordinarily illuminating book. Primo Levi, who managed against all odds to survive Auschwitz, come out of it, and then was brave enough to say that he was no hero, because all the heroes, they're all dead. People who agreed to share a handful of food with somebody else, they're all dead, they're all gone. So he himself agreed. And he calls it the gray zone. The no heroes, no villains. This is a great gray zone. And I see 1958 to 62 as a giant gray zone in there, where just routine degradations go hand in hand with mass destruction.
So let me ask you two questions now. One, as we get toward 1962, how does this come to an end? At what point, I mean, I guess this is 2 or 3 questions, you know, at what point, you know, I think you've demonstrated in your research that the party leadership is quite callous and indifferent to the massive loss of life and are by and large aware of what's going on in the countryside. At what point do they decide, either for, you know, presumably for practical or pragmatic rather than moral reasons, all right, we just simply need to bring a stop to this? How do they bring a stop to it? And how does the society survive after, I mean, we'll get to what happens in 1966 in a moment, but in the immediate aftermath of this famine and the Great Leap Forward, what presents or what prevents just the complete disillusion into a state of, you know, Hobbesian chaos?
It is a state of Hobbesian chaos. It is a gigantic black hole that has swallowed the lives of tens of millions. It is the abyss. It is bad. Qinghai province collapses altogether, has to be reconquered by the People's Liberation Army. It is chaos at every single level. In January 1961, there are, in the case of Gansu province alone, there are 500 cases of assaults by farmers on trains. In one case, 4,000 of them wait for a freight train to pass, assault the whole thing and strip the whole thing of every removable portion of property. It is chaos. And the extent of loss of life is such, the collapse of the transportation system, the damage to nature, housing, is such that the man who started it really has no choice but to somehow step back. And that's what he does.
And when does he realize that this is going to be necessary?
He realizes it when a report is put in front of him, and for some reason he decides that that report is too much.
Does he see this as an opportune time? He can say, you know, I had no idea, but then this report came to me, and...
No, he says, oh my God, I really didn't realize that so many of these party officials on the ground were counter-revolutionaries who have been abusing the people. So he turns it around and blames it on the very willing executioners, those who executed his every one order, blames it on them. Here you have another purge.
Well, right, and this leads, you date the end of the famine to 1962, and if
Yes,
my memory is correct, the Cultural
Yes.
Revolution begins in 1966.
Yes.
Is it right for us to understand the Cultural Revolution as essentially an attempt to regain what Mao would have seen as ground that was lost during the Great Leap Forward?
Yes, you cannot understand the Cultural Revolution without understanding Mao's Great Famine. In January 1962, at the end of all of this, 7,000 top leaders gather in Beijing. It's very clear that there is discontent with what has happened. Nobody will accuse Mao, the chairman, of being the main architect of this abysmal failure, but it's quite clear there's a lot of discontent. Liu Shaoqi, number 2, the one who wrote from Hunan about housing destruction, is one who indirectly puts Mao on the spot. So the Cultural Revolution that starts 4 years later must be seen as an attempt by Mao to make sure that all those who go around criticizing what he did, all those who might potentially undermine him, all those who might potentially come up with a conspiracy must be eliminated. Mao sees Liu Shaoqi as a future Khrushchev. Khrushchev is the man who denounced Stalin after his death, and Mao doesn't want anybody to denounce him, and he's going after them.
I'm going to put a final question to you, which is going to be a very vague one, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. What I'm curious about is, in spite of all of these disasters, and I think we've gone just into a little bit of detail, you sometimes still see people make the case that it is impossible to conceive of the Chinese state in its current form, and it's impossible to conceive of the Chinese Communist Party in its current form, without taking some account of the influence of Mao. And I suppose in some sense, one of the arguments here, one of the underlying arguments, is that for all of this brutality, for all of this terror, for all of this misguidedness, he is the man who held the country together. And, you know, when we wish to appreciate whatever achievements contemporary China has made, we must begrudgingly give some credit to Mao. I would like you to speak to that, and I assume you find it to be not a convincing account.
No, it's not convincing. It's a little bit like praising Adolf Hitler for having built highways, or saying that the economic success of Germany, really the foundations are in the 1930s, the firm hand of the Führer. No, I don't think so at all. It was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster, all the way through to the very death of the man himself in 1976. Now, of course, China now is completely different, a different world altogether, but not one that has really put a premium on political reform, I think it might be cautious to say.
Right.
So one shouldn't be too surprised if there are, in fact, all sorts of continuities between the China and the Mao and what we see today, contaminated food.
Right. But, I mean, would you say, for example, that Deng Xiaoping is a much more important figure to understand modern China than Mao?
No, the foundations of the state as they exist to this day were laid by Mao. He's the architect of the system, a system that continues to stay in place to this very day, including its culture of violence, its contaminated products, its doctored figures, its very non-transparent economy, and the enormous power it puts in the hands of local party officials.
All right. Thank you, Frank. Let's take it out to the audience here. Please, keep your questions short and in the form of a question.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you think the psychological effect of this is on the society as a whole as time goes on. There's been no mourning, and I'm thinking about the importance of mourning and what that does. Thank you.
It's a terribly difficult question for a number of reasons. First is that I honestly don't know because I haven't researched this. But of course you do come across people you interview about this period, and they will tell you what some of the psychological consequences are. Some people find it very difficult to relate to food in a natural way. By extrapolation, one might say that many find it difficult to relate to material goods in a way that others might perceive as more balanced. But the reality is that we simply don't know. That there is no memorial, there's no museum, there's no memory day, there's nothing there to really commemorate or remember what happened. People in the countryside, farmers, are not encouraged to speak out about what happened. Increasingly now, the last couple of years, one does see young students go to the countryside and interview whole villages, making documentary films or writing reports about it. So there very clearly is a desire, both in the countryside and in the cities, to examine this period and face that darkness that took place. But it's not encouraged by the state, and one can see why. It's one thing to condemn the Cultural Revolution and say this is Mao. It's another one to actually start thinking seriously about what happened during the Great Leap Forward, simply because so many leaders had a hand in it.
At the back, sir?
Good evening. This is about survivor of the Cultural Revolution, Ping Fu, who has been nominated as the advisor on innovation by Barack Obama, who set up Geomagic, and she was a victim of the Cultural Revolution, but she survived that, managed to escape, or whatever it is, get herself into America, and then set up Geomagic as a computer software development industry, which is now catching the imagination of the young people in the innovation field. So China, given such a lot of creative genius, she was one of the survivors. Would you say Mao would be responsible, or the Cultural Revolution would be responsible? And how many more of such people would be still seeking to set their creativity up at the international scale? Thank you.
Well, it's a difficult question, but one thing I realized is that most people on planet Earth are pretty damn creative, provided you let them get on with it. And the tragedy since 1949 is all the restrictions that have been put on freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religious belief, freedom of movement, etc., etc., etc. You asked me earlier on how come after this massive disaster, 1962-63, the economy somehow managed to get out of it, because for a very brief moment, the party let people get on with it. And I've no doubt that in a more open, accountable climate, China would be quite extraordinary in what it could come up with.
Hi.
Okay, go ahead.
My question is regarding writings on the whole tragedy. This year's Nobel laureate Mo Yan, in his writings, almost escapes the whole episode and compares, draws an analogy with the donkey's dick. I mean, which was many say quite tragic in itself. But we would like to know your opinion on the subject.
I wish I had an opinion. The problem is that I've tried to read Mo Yan several times, and I didn't find it all that riveting. Life is short. One cannot read everything. Mo Yan is not at the top of my list, so I simply don't know.
A very honest answer, I would say. The man in the green.
Thank you. You mentioned some of the individual acts of resistance in response to what happened. I'm wondering, thank you. Is there anything you found that shows something more systemic in people thinking about a whole different alternative to what Mao is trying to do? And like, for example, is there anything coming out of Chinese Confucianism, Buddhism, anything that represents a whole different view of what should happen?
Well, it's a very good question. It's a very complex one. But as far as I'm concerned, you don't have to go all the way back to Confucius. You could go back to the Republican era, the first half of the 20th century. That period that the communists set out to destroy from top to bottom. And a little book called The Age of Openness, I described this entire first half of the 20th century as an extraordinary laboratory of engagement with modernity, where people acquire some fairly basic freedoms to travel, for instance, not just rich elites or students going abroad, but ordinary farmers can buy a very cheap ticket on a steamer to go to the Philippines and work there for a couple of years. Freedom of speech that, despite all the censorship, was far more important than either before under Empire or later under Mao. So that whole first half of the 20th century has been very much denigrated by the communist regime and overlooked.
Right there in the front.
Hello. If a young generation comes up and asks you who Mao was, how would you describe him from your head and from your heart?
Could you repeat the first part of the
If
question?
a young man or woman comes to you and asks who Mao was, and how would you describe him from your head and from your heart?
Probably as a slightly psychopathic mass murderer.
Hello.
Strange reason to applaud, I think, but
Not from the heart.
Hello. My name is Dorjisten and I'm from Tibet, and my parents have personally experienced, or they are the victim of cultural revolution. So as you mentioned, it's exactly they feel this in the same way. In the Tibetan traditional shoes is made with yak skin on the heel, and then during the cultural revolution, if they don't have a food to eat and they need to boil the shoes, this sole of the shoes, and they need to eat it. So my question is, what cultural revolution mean for from the Tibetan freedom struggle point of view?
I don't think that the Cultural Revolution means anything except a very harsh purge among the top leadership, which has horrendous consequences for the population as a whole and Tibet in particular.
in the front.
Good afternoon, sir. My question actually has to do with your answer to a previous question where you talked about students going into the countryside and asking and making documentaries. How did the students get the idea that there is all of this? Where did they get this in, all this knowledge, or the thirst for this knowledge, if they were part of the institution and the education system that is controlled by?
A lot of my colleagues, historians in the People's Republic, are very courageous, and they've been working on this for quite some time. And even if they are sometimes a little cautious in what they publish, and frequently they publish in Hong Kong, quite clearly they do try to shape the next generation of historians. This particular instance, however, the students come from a documentary filmmaker in Beijing, and he's the one who's sending out his students to literally videotape these interviews with villagers who managed to get through the Great Famine. I think it indicates that, on the one hand, there isn't exactly, as I pointed out earlier on, a great amount of encouragement from the government, but on the other hand, there is a real abiding interest and desire to actually find out about that dark night of modern Chinese history, and not just, of course, the famine, but all the way back from 1949 through to the Cultural Revolution.
I'm going to steal a question from the audience here for a moment and ask you, are these archives becoming more open than they used to be as this kind of grassroots desire emerges to start learning a little bit more about this history that's been hidden?
I've been asked this question many times, and there is no real answer to it. It's quite random. It really depends on where you go, what time of the year, whoever's looking at you on Monday morning. Is this a person in a in a in a good mood or not. It's really random, and this leads me to another observation, namely that if you are a student of modern Chinese history and you have an interest, you should go out there and try, because you have no idea how much you will find out.
Where's the microphone? Right there? You might turn it on.
Nice hearing about the kind of observation that you've had about modern China and China during Mao's reign. But I would just like to know, first and foremost, I definitely have got a new definition for famine from here on. So famine would now be known as something else for me. And also, do you consider Mao and Joseph Stalin to be the bad examples of communism? I mean, if you consider communism to be a good form of government, do you consider Mao and Joseph Stalin to be bad examples of communism?
Well, it's often said that these regimes weren't really communist, but the point really is that communism is a very bad idea to start with. I don't know how you feel about sharing, but I might share a thing or two with my wife, but I don't really like sharing my car. To put things in common, as all these communist regimes have found out, leads to the stripping of the profit motive and the killing of any incentive to do anything. And this is extremely well exemplified by the Great Leap Forward, where farmers had strictly nothing that was their own, not even the tools to work with.
I think we've got time for one more, I'm afraid. And it's that guy with the microphone.
Is the growing awareness about the history of the Cultural Revolution and obviously the Famine before that cut both ways? As in, what I need to ask is, we have recently learned about, probably a couple of years back, how the province of Chongqing, correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably Chongqing, which has been now colored, increasingly being colored red, with getting to make students listen to Mao, the speeches of Mao in the schools, and painting the whole atmosphere red. So does it cut both ways? How is it that you place the resurgence of this interest in Mao and his philosophy?
Well, the man in charge of Chongqing, his name is Bo Xilai, and he didn't do too well recently. He was purged. Did I not say the party purges itself all the time? Well, this was the last one. So he's out. Could there be another form of resurgence? Quite frankly, I don't know, and I very much doubt it. I very much doubt it.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much to Frank. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your great questions. I believe, not to steal your line, that Frank will relocate to the book signing table over there, and you can go purchase your copies of Mao's Great Famine, and he will happily inscribe them with his signature. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Frank Dikotter and Jonathan Shainin, for that wonderful session. And like Jonathan said, the books are available. Please get them signed. Thank you. And this is for all the authors and speakers attending the Writers' Ball in the evening. 2 shuttles at 7:30 and 8:30 will take you to the venue, and while coming back, the shuttle timings are 10:30, 11:30 and 12:30. No